Thanks everybody for having us. I am Don Nees, CFO at Jitasa. I've been at Jitasa for 8 years, working as a financial analyst and other roles. And also joining us today is Boyd Orr, who has over 12 years of nonprofit leadership experience and also public accounting experience. And Boyd has served in various finance roles at various nonprofits in his past. So we're excited to present this and really talk about budgeting and forecasting, and hopefully helps everybody get a good understanding of some methods that can be used for your organization. So first we'll talk a little bit about what a budget is and what a forecast is, kind of some of those differences. We'll take a look at some steps in the budgeting process. We'll then go through the forecasting cycle, and we'll talk a little bit about leveraging technology. So as new technologies come out to really help try to streamline that process. And then we'll jump into Q&A. So first, we'll talk about what is a budget and what is a forecast. So a budget is a lot of things. So a planning tool to really help you identify resources and commitments to satisfy goals. It's a control tool to help ensure that you're controlling and make sure everything's on track. It's a motivational tool for staff and departments, and a communication tool throughout the organization. And also a coordination tool among your departments and staff. So biggest takeaway here is a budget is really around a plan for what your nonprofit wants to achieve in the future. We'll contrast that a little bit with a forecast. So a forecast is an indication of actual results that are going to be achieved or you expect to be achieved. It's typically performed on monthly or quarterly intervals. So typically the frequency is a little bit shorter frequency when you're doing a forecast, provides visibility into performance versus your budget in prior years. And it's typically limited to major items such as major revenue items and major expense items. So a forecast is really looking at, it's an expectation of what your nonprofit will achieve. So we're going to lay those out next to each other again so that we can kind of review the differences. So a budget typically has some sort of target. It's looking at what we want to happen. It should be maybe inspiring, motivating, and fairly detailed. Whereas a forecast is what we think will happen. So it's more looking at an unbiased expected outcome, has a little bit limited, typically more limited details into it. So again, budget is kind of your aspirations, what you want to happen, what you're working towards. Forecast is really looking at what is expected if you just continued in your steady state. Before we jump into a lot of the steps in a process, I think I want to talk through a couple things of kind of, it's always important to use your budget wisely. So some of the purposes of having a budget, or there can be some negatives to having a budget. So one thing is making sure that your incentives don't encourage what I'll call sandbagging, or kind of underestimating what your organization can achieve. So I'll use an example of if we're compensating a development officer on the amount of grants that they're going to bring in, and if they hit 100% of their goal, maybe they get this bonus for the year. So they're actually in a way incented to give a low target because they want to hit their bonus. So I always encourage people to kind of try to disconnect the budgeting process from compensation process and incentive process to make sure that the organization is striving for really relative performance year over year. Fixed targets can sometimes lead to marginal improvements, whereas relative targets encourage stretch goals. So relative targets are always kind of looking at what can we do better each year, and again, not really capping what your organization can achieve from the budget. As many of you know, once you've set your budget, you may be 3 months in, 6 months in, and sometimes your allocations just don't make sense. Maybe you've had a significant business change to where maybe one program's growing faster than the other. So a lot of times that needs reallocation of resources. So when you really stay set on your allocations, it's really hard to forecast out or project out 6 months in the future or 12 months. So I always encourage to be flexible as you allocate resources throughout the year, and just know that what you said at the beginning of the year, there's likely to be some changes in there. And then another thing to kind of watch for in the budgeting process is the question of, instead of asking yourself, is it in the budget? Ask yourself, are there better uses for these funds? So sometimes, for example, you may have budgeted that you need to buy 20 laptops for the year. You may get halfway through the year and you actually don't need to buy those 20 laptops. Maybe some laptops lasted longer. Maybe you didn't hire as many staff as you needed. But making sure that you're not just buying stuff because it's in the budget, but making sure it makes sense for your organization, and making sure that there aren't better use for the funds. So biggest takeaway: make sure you're using your budget wisely. So we'll start with, or we'll go on to this question of kind of how are ships budgeting and forecasting related. So looking at kind of navigating a ship, the path when you're navigating a ship in the ocean is you map out your destination. There can be lots of unforeseen obstacles such as weather, etc. The path of the ship is always continuously monitored as you're going towards your destination, and then corrective action is taken when the ship steers off course. So the budgeting process is actually really similar to navigating your ship, comparing your ship to your nonprofit, to really reaching your destination of your nonprofit's goals. So now that we've kind of compared the difference between budgeting and forecasting, we'll go into some steps of the budgeting process. So actually, before I touch on that, there are different types of budgeting methodologies that are pretty popular. So we'll touch on those first. The first method is kind of incremental budgeting. So that's taking your prior year numbers, adding or subtracting different things from those numbers to reach your current year budget. The pros of this type of budgeting is that it's simple and it's fairly easy to understand. It's usually a little bit quicker. It's easier for people to say, okay, I spent $20,000 on supplies last year. I expect maybe a 5% increase and move on. The cons of this is it can actually perpetuate some inefficiencies. So we'll use supplies again as an example. If you didn't actually need those $20,000 of supplies a year before, and if you just roll that number forward, it can perpetuate inefficiencies. The other method that's pretty common is a top-down budget. So that's really setting a high level goal. Maybe it's a overall revenue target. Maybe it's building a surplus of X amount, and then pushing down to each department to really then fit together the pieces of how you're going to reach that high level goal. Some pros of this are that it provides a really clear goal for each department to really work towards collectively to kind of hit a North Star of a high level goal that your organization's going towards. Some possible cons with this type of budgeting is that it may miss a lot of details, or it may just not be realistic. So again, kind of being cognizant of that con. Another method, or the last method we'll touch on a little bit, is a bottom-up or zero-based budget. So this really assumes that all budgets start from scratch, and really every single account starts from zero, and you're building everything from the bottom up. The pros of this is it really evaluates all budgetary items to question or ensure that they have a value proposition for your organization. Some cons are that it is very time intensive and takes a lot of your time. So which one of these methods is the best? It kind of depends. Everybody has their own approach, and everybody's operating model is different. I usually like to use some sort of a blended approach among all these. So sometimes there are some key accounts that I really like to dig into and start from zero. There are some other accounts that probably aren't as relevant or as material in your overall budgeting process that really makes sense to kind of not spend as much time on. Uh, Before we touch on some more specific steps, we'll talk about some budgeting do's and don'ts. So some do's of your budgeting process is definitely involve stakeholders in the process. Use as realistic assumptions as you can. Make sure to communicate your budget to everybody who's involved in your organization. Really work to understand your critical drivers and the KPIs that are really behind the numbers in your budget, and then really stay agile. So understand that there are sensitivities. So some accounts or some assumptions are really going to drive, 70% of your budget. Make sure you scenario model and be flexible with significant changes, because just know that typically once you're 6 months down the road, you'll have something that you didn't really anticipate. Maybe it's bad, maybe it's good. So just be really, really flexible there. Some don'ts of budgeting is don't be unrealistic and set yourself up for failure. So setting stretch goals is okay. Setting something where you know that you absolutely know you're not going to hit it usually isn't that helpful. So really making sure that you're not overestimating demand, or you're really not underestimating labor. Um, don't do it yourself. So it's very, depending on the size of your organization, it can be very, very difficult to know every single thing. So make sure to include your team. Don't forget about the possibility of economic changes, inflation rates, interest rates, most recently a pandemic. So always make sure that you're trying to account for some economic changes. Don't budget in silos. So again, make sure that everybody knows, each of your departments knows the roles, and really making sure that everybody's rowing in the same direction. And then don't fixate on immaterial items that really won't influence your performance. So if you have a $10 a month line item in your budget, it probably doesn't really matter if you spend that $10 a month or not. So really spend your time on the items that are really going to drive your performance. Um, so with that, we'll go into steps in the budgeting process that we'll talk about in more detail in a second. So step number one that I like to follow is define your budgeting cycle. Then we want to look at, we'll talk through ensuring you have up-to-date historical data. We'll analyze your historical information for key drivers. We'll want to talk about starting with the end in mind when you're going through the budgeting process. We'll talk about setting your revenue targets, aligning your resources, iterating to achieve your goal, approving and implementing. So the first step will, in kind of the overall budget cycle, is to define your actual budget cycle. So period lengths can change depending on your organization. A lot of organizations use an annual budgeting process. Sorry, my phone rang for a second. Can you still hear me, Boyd? Yeah, okay. So period length, annual is the most typical. But there are some organizations operating models where a semi-annual budget makes sense, or a quarterly budget makes sense, depending on variability. And is what's becoming very, very more popular is having some sort of rolling budget, to where you're either always creating a budget for the next 6 months, or maybe it's the next 18 months, or maybe it's the next 24 months. So the period length of your budgeting process really depends, although typically this is seen annually at many organizations. Then you'll really want to define what the timeline to build and implement your budget is. So making sure that everybody's clear on when you expect to have the budget, how long the budget's going to take to produce, who all needs to be involved, and then kind of what that timeline is of what the expectation usually of your board of directors is to get that budget implemented. Next step is make sure you define what the process is for approving your budget. Typically involves board of directors. Biggest thing is just to make sure that ensure that all of your stakeholders know the timeline of your budget, so that they can make sure that they're allocating the appropriate time to complete it on time, so that it can be implemented. So now that we've gone through, we want to define our budget cycle. Next step is really to ensure that you have accurate historical information. So I look at this as your data that you have and your decision making that you have for your budget is only good as the information that you have in your financial books. So it's kind of the garbage in, garbage out scenario. If your historical data isn't very good, you may have a hard time setting a budget for the year that's realistic. So having quality data will make sure that your assumptions and drivers are really accurate looking into your future budget. So now that we have our accurate historical information, this is where we'll go through and really analyze all that information. So some things that we're looking for is relationships between different financial items. So it's, an example is my marketing spend related to my individual contributions each year? So kind of understanding different relationships between different accounts, understanding seasonality. So it's really nice to know from a cash flow perspective if you're getting a $1 million grant, but maybe it's spread out over 3 quarters, making sure that you may be recognizing all that grant in 1 month, but knowing that cash inflow is actually going to be spread out among different quarters. Understanding your one-time versus recurring expenses. So that's helpful of rent is something that's kind of recurring. So it's fairly easy to project out and understand how that's going to impact your cash flow or the total amount for the year. And then also understanding what are one-time expenses. So, or revenue influxes. So just understanding what those timing pieces are. Next step that we're kind of going to look for is understanding your common size and materiality. So many of the nonprofits we work with, typically 80% of their spending is really really concentrated on 3 accounts, with usually salaries and related being one of those accounts. So really focus on, if staffing is a major item in your budget, make sure you really plan out your staffing and spend a lot of time on that, as opposed to maybe you have some kind of more immaterial accounts, such as just maybe it's bank fees, right? So maybe you spend $1,000 in bank fees a year. Really makes sense to make sure you're spending time on the accounts that are actually going to drive your results. And then last piece is just understand the key drivers of your financials. So examples are, if you sell items, just know that know your volume of sales and expected volume to really hit revenue targets for that product that you may be selling. So all of this information is going to be used to really identify the key drivers and assumptions that are going to be made in your budget. So again, it's really important to work through your historicals and to understand the interaction between your accounts and really major accounts in the past. Next step we'll talk through is start with the end in mind. So before we go through the entire budgeting process, we kind of want to align usually all of your stakeholders, specifically your board of directors, are really, what are your dreams and aspirations? Are you going to be looking to expand your current programs? Are you looking to fund a new program? Are you looking to build a surplus for sustainability? So this is really important to make sure that really at the very beginning, you're kind of aligning where you would like the organization to go. So sometimes you may get into it, it may not be 100%, or maybe it's just not feasible, but it's always good at the very beginning to really agree on a direction, so that you don't have some people who are working towards building a surplus, but maybe some other people are saying, hey, we actually don't want to build a surplus. We want to build out a brand new program that's going to cut into some of this surplus. So always making sure that everybody is aligned on kind of the strategic direction. Next step is really looking at setting your revenue targets. So this can be one of the hardest pieces. Maybe feels like you're looking into a magic ball or trying to forecast out or predict the future. Some of the best ways to do this are really factor your large revenue sources to make sure to base the factoring on your likelihood of securing the funding. So I think the biggest piece here is, don't assume that all of your funding is 100% unless you really know it is. So always ensure that you work to understand seasonality, so the timing at which revenue comes in, and then really use historical data to guide your decision. So some of your revenue targets always depend upon your comfort level from how aggressive you want to be, but I do always encourage to kind of lay out some percentages or probabilities to make sure that you're really not creating an unrealistic revenue budget. If you can't reach your goals, your budget goals or budget target or goals, one of the biggest pieces is just identify it as a risk in the budget. So we talked about in the previous slide of kind of making sure everybody's going in the same direction. If the goal really is to, maybe it's to grow your revenue 20%, and you may not be able to do that without making a more aggressive revenue target, that's okay. Just make sure that you call it out and say, this is a risk in our budget. Next step is really looking at aligning resources. So some considerations are looking, really understanding your fixed costs versus variable costs. So fixed costs are really going to stay the same while the variable costs are going to change with volume. Some examples are, of some fixed costs, or maybe your office rent, right? So if you have capacity for 30 staff and you're paying office rent, you only currently have 15 staff, then that's a fixed cost that you don't really need to expand over time. Next one is understand your discretionary versus non-discretionary spend. So this is always really helpful to say, I always look at what are the minimum expenses required to operate. And so really identify those, because you know that later on in the process, if you do need to trim down any expenses in your budget, you kind of know you're separating expenses into those that you can't really trim down versus those that are probably, they might be nice to have, or maybe you're able to postpone them for a year or two. But it's always helpful to kind of separate them out into those two categories. And then also understanding when you're talking about the expense side of things is what your one-time spending is versus a recurring spend. And this is probably more important from a cash flow perspective, but really knowing that if you need to prepay maybe an annual license for a software, or maybe it's some sort of insurance, if you need to prepay that at the beginning of the year, just making sure you're taking that into account, primarily from a cash flow perspective. So typically it'll be amortized throughout the year, but it's always nice to know when that's actually, when the cash is leaving your bank account. So once you've kind of gone through, looked at the revenue side of things and the expense side of things, typically this is the step where you're going to iterate to achieve your goal, or you're going to realign your goal. So at this stage, I always say typically reality sets in, and it's okay. So sometimes you have this big wish list, everybody's working towards this major goal, and you finally roll up all the numbers, and it may not be what you wanted it to be, and that's okay. That's very, very typical. So this is really the process where you go through and identify areas of maybe that spending may not be necessary, identify additional funding opportunities, and then really work to close that gap between your funding and spending. Most importantly is if you do have a risky or aggressive budget, or risky or aggressive assumptions in your plan, just make sure that that's clearly articulated specifically to your board or whoever is approving the budget. So always expect to have a difference between your kind of initial budget and your expected goals, and then typically a lot of the work is kind of working to close those gaps between the two. So now that we've gone through the process of setting our revenue targets, our expense targets, and we've kind of iterated to reach our goal, your budget's really ready for approval and to implement. So that's where you'll enter it in your accounting and reporting system. Really good to re-communicate the approved budget to your staff. So sometimes as the budget, you may have an initial budget, it may change many times. So making sure that all the changes are actually communicated to your staff is important. And then the last piece of it is do not change your budget. So don't, it's not really helpful if you're going to go back and try to just align the budget to what your actuals are. Just think of the budget as a guideline to help guide you in your path. So so now that you've comparing this back to our ship analogy, you've now planned where your ship its destination is going. So now we will talk a little bit about the forecasting cycle after now that we've implemented our budget. So So now you're ready for forecasting. We've gone through all these steps of setting the budget. We have on our track over here, we can kind of see the finish line clear down there. Now it's the step where we're ready for forecasting. And we're really going to be working towards the finish line by kind of doing a frequent forecast to ensure we're on track with our budget, or also make changes if we need to kind of correct to achieve our budget. The forecasting cycle kind of has two major pieces to it. It's again, remember, the forecasting is looking at what we think will happen, and we're comparing that to our budget, what we want to happen. So the frequency at which we reform our forecasts can depend. We need to determine the frequency of the forecast and then the length of forecast. So it's common to look out, maybe you're going to forecast out 4 months. And then as you get into it, you may just do a monthly forecast. Maybe you're going to forecast out 4 quarters. Everybody has a different approach here. But the biggest part is, no matter what your length and your forecast cycle is always focusing on continuous improvement to really achieve your goals. So the first step is once you complete a forecast, you want to really reassess at where you are now versus the budget that you set out. You want to look at trend analysis to see whether your major assumptions and drivers have changed from what you thought. Then you really want to work on identifying whether you have more demand, whether you have capacity, whether you don't have capacity. Maybe you have some new initiatives that are upcoming. Maybe there are some risks in your plan. And then you really want to work to basically align resources and really prioritize value-added initiatives. And then also work to eliminate non-value-added initiatives. So again, it's really a continuous cycle of re-looking and rechecking where you're at, comparing that to budget, saying, are my resources aligned appropriately? And it's not so much as, am I on budget? It's more of what are the actions that or assumptions that we thought in our original budget, but then that we can change to either improve upon our financial performance or kind of get us back on track. So that is a quick overview of kind of the forecasting piece. The final step we'll talk through is leveraging technology to streamline the process. So there are a lot of dangers of budgeting and forecasting in Excel alone. And the good news is that there's a lot of technology coming out that's kind of helping in this area. But as we're budgeting and forecasting in Excel, there's typically issues with version control, lack of security. So a perfect example is usually salary data. So really trying to compile salary data. But if that's budget's being shared around, you want to make sure that some of that's confidential. Last minute changes are sometimes hard to incorporate into an Excel model. There's complexity with multiple worksheets and workbooks. And oftentimes it's difficult to build multiple scenarios because you want to make sure you're not destroying the underlying data or model. And then I'm sure everybody's seen this, getting those errors that say NA or divided by 0, trying to eliminate that. So that's one reason where there are newer technologies coming out, and they're not all perfect yet, but I do anticipate, in the future they're going to get more streamlined. So some things to look for when you're going to use a technology to do any sort of budgeting forecasting is making sure that you have some sort of historical analysis. So it allows you to really analyze past periods to help predict future results. So that may be regression analysis, or really taking the averages of the last 6 months, 12 months, 3 months, whatever's kind of relevant for that account, but having really easy access to analyze that historical data. Next is really ensuring that a technology solution you go with has layered planning. So the ability to really quickly add new initiatives or outcomes without destroying the underlying model is really important. And then scenario planning. So really making sure that any technology you use lets you plan for the best case, worst case, and kind of expected scenarios, making sure that that's really easy to do without destroying your model. And it's also helpful to have automatic updates that actually bring in actuals from your accounting system that you use, because this really speeds up the forecasting process and also the reporting process on how you're doing versus your budget. And then also Excel imports. So Excel will never go away likely. It's a very useful tool. So it's also helpful to make sure that, technology as it is today is really hard to do everything budget wise in that technology. So Excel sheets can be very helpful to supplement some of that information. And this is an area that's rapidly evolving in the finance and accounting space. So all the tools that are out there today, I expect, 3 years from now, we'll have even more integrated technologies, and specifically those that serve the nonprofit sector, which will be really exciting. So with that, I'll actually open it up for Q&A. I'll get before I do that, we do Jitasa. We specialize in finance and accounting services for nonprofits. But if anybody on the call is interested about learning more about Jitasa, I put one of our sales executives information up here on the screen. But with that, I'll open it up for Q&A.